Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've shown you this bike before. I'm now sort of ready to do the rear main seal and the flywheel sleeve O-ring and the oil cover O-ring in here. I'll inspect the clutch while it's apart, and if necessary we will replace anything that needs to be replaced in there. Thing to think about with the BMW clutch is it's a dry clutch just like a car, and that's one of the little issues that they have with trying to get the shifts really nice in these. You know, the engine on a Japanese bike, the clutch travels at about half the speed of the crankshaft, and it's in oil and it's a multiple disc clutch. This is a single dry friction plate and with the pressure plate, just like a car. The release mechanism works the opposite way around to a car, but I won't bore you with all that. Now, one of the things you can see on there is a whole bunch of white marks, and what they are is the beginning of me marking up things to make sure they go back in the same orientation. Very first thing you do, I don't know if you're going to be able to see, yep, there it is. You get it onto top dead center, line it up, and then mark that out and across the various components. Now, as I take the clutch assembly off, I will mark the flywheel and the flywheel bolt hole that corresponds to that particular orientation, so that when I put it back I get all my timing marks back. And also, although these components are all balanced, it's quite possible that if you spin them around the other way you might get a vibration. So I've never actually managed to achieve that, but I've never tried either. So I always mark everything, take it apart, then put it back the same way. I'm just going to pause this now. I've already undone the bolts that retain the pressure plate, and I'm going to take that off and then show you what's behind that. So the clutch plate's out of the way, and as you can see I've marked through to the pressure plate. That is actually the pressure plate there, and your clutch throwout rod, which runs through the center of the gearbox from the clutch lever at the back, actually presses in there and pushes that spring in, and that is what actually engages and disengages and keeps the pressure on your clutch so that you get a drive. Now we're at the back of the flywheel, such as it is on these later model bikes, and just here I'm marking now the mounting position of this. It's a bit messy, but it's just the way I do it. Other people might have different ways. And that just tells me when I take that off, I will actually mark that same hole behind it, and that makes sure that I get everything back and the timing marks are actually in the correct position. You can see everything's got a nice little coating of oil here, so if the clutch wasn't slipping before the bike came in here, it certainly wouldn't have been very long until it was. I'm not sure what I'm going to find there, but I've got a couple of other things to show you before I can take that off. It's a little bit noisy here this afternoon, so you'll just have to bear with that. I can't do too much about it. Now, one of the things that you've probably heard again and again and again about is about blocking the crankshaft if you're going to take the flywheel off. And there's a very good reason for that, because the way it all works is that the alternator, of course, runs on the end of the crankshaft, but the crankshaft can actually move backwards and forwards inside the block. And what stops it from doing that is on the other side of this flywheel assembly here, there's an aluminium bulkhead that holds the rear main bearing, and it also holds a set of thrust washers. Now, these are flat metal discs that are lined with something which I guess is probably a similar thing to what you find in a big end bearing shell. They come in different thicknesses, and they're designed so that when you bolt the flywheel up, you pull it back onto these thrust washers, and that leaves exactly the right amount of clearance and free play and tolerance for the crank to be able to spin, but not to be able to move backwards and forwards. Now, problem is when you take the flywheel off the bike, unless you block the crankshaft, it will now be able to move backwards and forwards, and the distance that it can move would actually surprise you. It's probably 1/4 of an inch or even a little more than that. And if you don't block it before you take it off, before you take the flywheel off, and you happen to push the crankshaft forward, those thrust washers are held on the other side of that aluminium block bulkhead there on 2 little dowels. And if you happen to be lucky enough to push them off the dowel, then you can sit down and have a couple of beers and a good long cry, because you have to take the cylinders and barrels off to get in there to be able to push those those thrust washers back onto the dowels, if you try to bolt it back up, and many people have, what will happen is that you'll pinch the dowels on the pegs that they're supposed to sit against, and probably damage them beyond being able to be reused, and on top of that you'll lock the engine up when you try to do the bolts up. So all around tears if you don't block the crankshaft. So how do we do that? Well, I've done it the same way for 20 years. Everyone's got different ideas. This is what I use. It's a simple nylon tap washer, and what I do with those is I cut about 1/4 of an inch off the end of the shank of the tap washer, and then I bind it with 2 or 3 or 4 wraps of electrical tape, just enough so that it'll push into the rotor retaining bolt there and actually sit there firmly in place, as you can see. Now I'm going to turn the camera off again for a second, and I'll just show you what we do to block the crankshaft. So here we are now. I've got the housing back in place. This is a little bit tricky to try and show you with one hand and a camera phone and talk at the same time. I'm flat out rubbing my tummy and patting my head, so for me this is a bit of a feat. But if you look down in here, you can see that that tap washer is holding the front cover away from the timing case by about 1/8 of an inch, or a little more than that. So now when I put the bolts back in here and tighten them up, you don't tighten them up gorilla tight, but you tighten them up nice and snug, so that timing case cover, or timing cover, pushes hard against that tap washer, and that will stop it from being able to be pushed forward when you are working on the crank. That's the method I use. There are other people who have all kinds of special tools and things. I've used it for many years, and it's quite perfectly fine, so long as you make sure that it's firmly seated in the rotor and that the housing has not gone all the way home, indicating that the thing's fallen out. You've got to make sure that the crankshaft is blocked before you take the flywheel off the back of the crankshaft. Otherwise you will be absolutely devastated, I promise you.